In the dense woods of Appalachia, Sarah Matthews stood alone, one hand on her swollen belly, the other clutching a rusty hammer. 6 months pregnant and freshly abandoned, she had exactly $47 to her name and nowhere to go. The small patch of forgotten land her grandmother had left her was all she had left in the world. No electricity, no running water. Just trees, silence, and the growing life inside her. What others saw as trash discarded lumber, abandoned metal sheets, forgotten windows from a demolition site, Sarah saw differently. While the world had given up on her, she refused to give up on herself or her unborn child. Could a woman with no construction experience really build a home sturdy enough to withstand both nature's elements and life's cruelest storms? 3 months earlier, Sarah had stared at the plastic stick in her bathroom, 2 pink lines changing everything. Her hands trembled as she showed it to Jack that evening in their small apartment. His face had fallen, not with fear but with something worse, calculation. "I can't do this right now, Sarah," he'd said, voice flat. "I'm finally getting somewhere with the bank." She'd nodded, understanding his shock. "We'll figure it out together," she'd promised. But Jack's absence began that very night, first emotionally, then physically. Band practices ran later. His texts became sporadic. Their 3 years together seemed to evaporate with each passing day. The framed photo on their dresser, Jack and Sarah at the lake last summer, started to feel like evidence of another life entirely. She'd hold it sometimes, tracing his smile with her finger, wondering when his eyes had gone cold. Their landlord called 2 weeks after Jack missed his half of the rent. "I like you, Sarah, but business is business." The diner where she waited tables noticed her growing belly before she'd found the courage to tell them. Her hours were cut, then cut again. "Customers don't want their food served by someone who might pop any minute," her manager explained with fake concern. She'd come home one night to find Jack packing his guitars. "I'll send money when I can," he'd promised, not meeting her eyes. The band got offered a tour, West Coast. "It's the break we've been waiting for." "We've been waiting for," she'd corrected. "I've been waiting to not feel sick every morning. I've been waiting for you to come to one doctor's appointment." He'd left his key on the counter, muttering something about needing to find himself. 2 weeks later, the eviction notice appeared. Sarah had packed methodically, donating what wouldn't fit in her 2 suitcases. The final night, sitting cross-legged on the empty apartment floor, she'd sorted through a box of family papers her mother had given her years ago. There it was, folded and yellowed with age. The deed to her grandmother's land in the mountains, 5 acres of nothing much, according to her mother. Too remote, too undeveloped, to be worth selling. Sarah remembered visiting once as a child, the trees taller than any building she'd known, the silence deeper than any she'd experienced. She'd called Jack one last time. "I'm pregnant, not terminal," she'd said, when he finally answered. "This is your child too." "I can't right now, Sarah. Maybe after the tour." There will always be another tour. The silence on the line had been answer enough. The real estate agent she'd consulted had laughed gently. "That land might fetch 8,000 in this market. After our fees and taxes, you'd clear maybe 6. Not enough for a fresh start in the city." Sarah had thanked him and walked out, the deed still in her hand. The last of her years bought a bus ticket to Pinecrest, the nearest town to her grandmother's property. As the city disappeared behind her, Sarah pressed her forehead against the cool window, one hand resting on her stomach. "It's just us now," she whispered to her unborn child. "But we've got land, we've got a chance." The pregnancy book tucked in her bag detailed the development of a 14-week fetus. "Your baby is now the size of a lemon." Sarah thought about how something so small could cause such seismic shifts in her world. How it could make a man flee and a woman find courage she never knew she had. In her purse was $47, the deed, and a faded photograph of her grandmother standing proudly in front of a small cabin that no longer existed. The image of that straight-backed woman had become a talisman. If her grandmother could carve a life out of those woods as a widow in the 1950s, perhaps Sarah could do the same as a soon-to-be single mother in the present day. The positive pregnancy test was still wrapped in tissue in her toiletry bag. She couldn't bring herself to throw it away, this small plastic harbinger that had simultaneously ended one life and begun another. She would keep it to remind herself that endings and beginnings often came disguised as each other. The bus wheezed to a stop at a faded sign reading Pinecrest, Pop. 842. Sarah gathered her bags, nodding thanks to the driver who eyed her belly with concern. The station was little more than a weathered bench outside the town's only gas station. "You got someone meeting you, honey?" the driver asked, hesitating before closing the door. "Yes," Sarah lied, summoning a confident smile. "They're on their way." She waited until the bus disappeared around the bend before shouldering her backpack and grabbing her suitcase. According to her map, the property lay 4 miles north. With each step, the weight of her decisions pressed down alongside the weight of her bags. The paved road gave way to gravel, then to dirt. May sunshine filtered through dense trees, warming her face despite her exhaustion. Twice, she stopped to rest, sipping carefully from her water bottle, rationing what remained. When she finally saw the rusted mailbox with Matthews barely visible beneath decades of weathering, tears sprang to her eyes. The narrow dirt driveway disappeared into undergrowth, nature reclaiming what humans had abandoned. Sarah pulled the deed from her pocket, confirming the boundaries. 5 acres of wilderness, and somewhere within it, the foundation of her grandmother's long-gone cabin. She pushed through overgrown bushes, thorns catching at her clothes, as if the land itself questioned her resolve. A clearing appeared, and Sarah dropped her bags. Here, the trees opened to reveal a patch of sky, a natural amphitheater in the wood. Remnants of a stone foundation peeked through tall grass. Her grandmother's home, now just a memory in the earth. With the last of her energy, Sarah pitched her small tent, a clearance item she'd grabbed with her final paycheck. Inside, she spread her sleeping bag and collapsed, one hand protectively over her growing belly. "We're home," she whispered, the words sounding both ridiculous and profound in the forest silence. She woke to birdsong and morning sickness, crawling from the tent to be sick in the bushes. Afterward, she sat back on her heels, wiping her mouth and taking stock of her surroundings in the clear morning light. The property sloped gently, offering natural drainage. Mature oak and maple trees provided canopy, while berry bushes grown wild suggested fertile soil. Most promising was the sound of running water. Following it, Sarah discovered a small spring bubbling from rocks at the property's edge. Clean, cold water that would sustain life. Testing it with her fingers, she laughed for the first time in weeks. "Water," she told her unborn child. "We have water." The practical challenges loomed large. No electricity, no plumbing, no walls or roof. But the fundamental elements were here. Land, water, timber. People had built from less for thousands of years. She spent that first day exploring, marking the property's corners with bright fabric strips from her old waitressing uniform. The physical activity settled her churning stomach better than the crackers she'd been relying on. The sense of being watched prickled the back of her neck late afternoon. Turning, she spotted an elderly man at the property line, leaning on a walking stick. His weathered face registered surprise at being noticed. "Hello," Sarah called, walking toward him with deliberate confidence. He nodded, but didn't speak, eyes moving from her face to her belly. "I'm Sarah Matthews. This was my grandmother's land. Eleanor's girl." His voice was rough from disuse or age. "Granddaughter," she corrected. He nodded again. "Elijah Tanner, your grandmother's place has been empty long time now." "I know. I'm changing that." His eyes narrowed, taking in her city clothes, her solitary presence. "Winter comes hard here." "I'll be ready," she said, with more conviction than she felt. He seemed to weigh her words, then turned to leave. After 3 days of camping and exploring her land, Sarah's resolve hardened into determination. She needed knowledge, the kind that couldn't be found in these silent woods. Wearing her cleanest outfit and with her hair racy braided, she began the 4-mile walk to town. Pinecrest's main street was a modest collection of buildings, hardware store, grocery, diner, church, and to Sarah's relief, a small library. The brick building stood apart from the others, with garden beds flanking its entrance where spring flowers nodded in the breeze. Inside, cool air and the smell of books welcomed her. A grey-haired woman looked up from the desk, glasses perched on her nose. "Hello there. Haven't seen you before," she said, taking in Sarah's city clothes and pregnant belly with a glance. "I just moved to the area. I'm Sarah Matthews, Eleanor Matthews' granddaughter." Recognition flashed in the librarian's eyes. "Eleanor's girl. I'm Marge Donovan. Your grandmother and I were in the same gardening club years back." Her expression softened. We all wondered what would happen to that property. Sarah smiled. "I'm living there now. Actually, I'm hoping to get a library card. I need to do some research." Marge's eyebrows rose slightly, but she pulled out a form. "Address?" Sarah hesitated, then wrote her grandmother's property location. If Marge noticed the lack of a house number, she didn't comment. Card in hand, Sarah began gathering books: basic carpentry, wilderness survival, self-sufficient living, pregnancy and childbirth. She added edible plants of Appalachia and off-grid home construction to her growing stack. "Quite the reading list," Marge commented as she checked out the books. "I've got a lot to learn," Sarah admitted. "Your grandmother was a resourceful woman. Built that cabin herself after your grandfather passed, you know." Sarah hadn't known. The revelation sent a small thrill through her. Building was in her blood. "The computers are over there if you need them," Marge added, gesturing to 3 ancient desktops. "Internet's slow, but works most days." Sarah spent hours at those computers, researching off-grid living, simple construction techniques, and reclaimed building materials. She printed articles about pallet construction, pier foundations, and rainwater collection systems, carefully counting out change for each precious page. By closing time, Sarah had filled a notebook with sketches and plans. A small cabin, just 12 by 16 feet, large enough for her needs, small enough to be achievable. She'd need lumber, windows, a door, roofing material. The cost at retail would be impossible, but using reclaimed materials might bring it within reach. "We're closing, dear," Marge called gently. Sarah gathered her books and notes. "Is there anywhere in town that might have building materials? Discards or scraps?" Marge considered this. "There's a construction site at the edge of town, building a new bank branch, and the town dump might have usable items. People here throw away perfectly good things sometimes." Sarah thanked her and stepped outside, the weight of the books in her backpack balanced by the lightness of having a plan. "Sarah," Marge called after her, "if you're walking back to Eleanor's land, you'd best start now to beat nightfall." The concern in the older woman's voice warmed something in Sarah that had been cold since Jack's departure. That evening, by the light of a battery-powered lamp, Sarah spread her resources on the tent floor. The library card lay atop her books, a small plastic rectangle that represented access to knowledge, to progress. She traced her finger over her name printed on its surface. In the following days, Sarah developed a routine. Mornings were spent improving her campsite, creating a better fire pit, organizing her supplies, exploring her land. Afternoons every other day were for the 4-mile walk to town, research at the library, and careful observation of where usable materials might be found. She created detailed drawings, calculating minimum material needs. The foundation would be simple concrete blocks, rather than a full foundation, cheaper, easier, and possible for one person to manage. The frame would be standard 2x4 construction if she could find enough lumber. Pallets could be disassembled for wall sheathing. At night, by lamplight, she read about pregnancy, marking her place in the developmental timeline. "Your baby is now the size of an avocado," the book told her. She tried to imagine this small life growing within her, dependent on her success. In town, she began to notice things she'd overlooked before: a pile of discarded lumber behind the hardware store, windows removed from a renovation leaning against a dumpster, wooden pallets stacked behind the grocery store. The town revealed itself as a resource to eyes trained to see potential where others saw trash. "Your grandmother had that same look," Marge commented one day at the library, "like she was seeing things the rest of us missed." Sarah smiled, accepting the connection to a woman she barely remembered, but whose determination now flowed in her veins. She closed the carpentry book she'd been studying and picked up her pencil, refining her cabin plans for the 10th time. Sarah spotted the yard sale sign while walking back from the library. The faded DZ symbols drew her like a beacon. With just $30 remaining after buying essential supplies, every purchase required careful consideration. She browsed the tables of cast-offs until she found it, a child's red wagon with rubber tires, slightly rusted but sturdy. The older woman running the sale wanted $15. Sarah offered $8, explaining she needed it for hauling materials. They settled on $10. "Building something?" the Thorn asked, as Sarah counted out singles. "A home," Sarah replied simply, surprising herself with the admission. The woman's eyes flicked to Sarah's belly. "By yourself?" "Yes." A moment of silence passed between them. Then the woman disappeared into her garage, returning with a hammer and a box of assorted nails. "These were my husband's. Take them. No charge." Sarah's first collection vehicle, a child's wagon, became her constant companion. The irony wasn't lost on her. Soon she'd have a child who could ride in it, but for now, it served a more fundamental need. The construction site at the edge of town became her first target. Gathering courage, she approached a man who appeared to be supervising. "Excuse me," she called. "Do you throw away any usable lumber?" The foreman looked her up and down, taking in her pregnant form and the red wagon behind her. "This isn't a charity, lady. I'm not asking for charity, just wondering about materials you discard anyway." He shook his head dismissively. "Can't help you. Liability issues." Sarah nodded politely and walked away, but didn't leave. Instead, she settled on a bench across the street, watching. At lunch break, she approached a worker eating alone. "I'm building a small cabin," she explained. "I'm looking for materials you might throw away." The man, Miguel, according to his vest, studied her with warm brown eyes. The boss said no, he's concerned about liability. Miguel took another bite of his sandwich, considering her. "We toss a lot that could be used. End pieces, slightly damaged lumber. Come by after 6. I can't give you company property, but I might accidentally leave some scrap near the dumpster." That evening, Sarah returned to find a small pile of 2x4 cut-offs and a sheet of plywood with a damaged corner. She loaded them carefully into her wagon, the weight making the journey home twice as long. The town dump yielded greater treasures. For a small fee, the attendant let her browse through construction debris. She found concrete blocks for her foundation, several undamaged windows that had been replaced during renovations, and assorted hardware: hinges, screws, even an intact door handle. Behind the grocery store, the manager agreed to save pallets for her instead of having them hauled away. "You're really building something all by yourself?" he asked skeptically. "One piece at a time," Sarah answered, disassembling a pallet with her pry bar to fit it in the wagon. Her campsite began to transform into a building yard. She sorted materials meticulously, lumber in one stack, sheathing materials in another, windows carefully wrapped in old blankets to prevent damage. She labeled everything with a system only she understood, mapping each piece to her planned home in her mind. The physical toll was significant. Her back ached constantly, and her feet swelled after long days of walking. But the growing collection of materials represented something profound: progress, possibility, proof that her vision wasn't mere fantasy. One evening, returning with a load of salvaged furring strips, she found Elijah Tanner standing at the edge of her camp. He didn't speak, just watched as she unloaded her wagon. Finally, He nodded toward her organized piles. "Need a tarp for those," he commented, looking at the sky. "Rain coming tomorrow." Before she could respond, he walked away. The next morning, she found a folded blue tarp at the edge of her property, weighed down with a stone. No note, no explanation, just silent assistance that acknowledged her work without undermining her independence. The tarp became essential as her collection grew. She constructed simple racks from branches to keep materials off the damp ground, covering them carefully each night. Gradually, Sarah developed an eye for overlooked resources. She could spot usable materials where others saw only trash, discarded gutters that could become a rainwater collection system, an old wooden ladder that could provide lumber for trim work, a discarded roll of house wrap that would help insulate her walls. Every trip to town became a scavenging expedition. The red wagon, initially an object of curiosity or pity to townspeople, began to represent something different: determination, resourcefulness, the stubborn refusal to be defeated. "Never seen someone get so much use out of that thing," the hardware store owner commented one day as she passed, wagon loaded with salvaged rigid foam insulation. Sarah patted the wagon's handle affectionately. "It's not what most people see when they look at it," she replied, "but it's exactly what I needed." Like the discarded materials she collected, the wagon had been given a second life, a new purpose. Sarah couldn't help feeling a kinship with it. Underestimated, overlooked, but surprisingly capable when given the chance. Sarah woke before dawn, morning sickness forcing her from the relative warmth of her sleeping bag. After retching into the designated spot away from her camp, she pressed a cool cloth to her forehead and waited for the nausea to pass. The baby, now 18 weeks along according to her dog-eared pregnancy book, seemed determined to remind her daily of its presence. Today would be different. After weeks of planning and gathering materials, she would begin the actual construction. The foundation needed to be in place before her pregnancy advanced further, making physical labor more difficult. She ate a small breakfast of crackers and peanut butter, washing it down with spring water, then surveyed her building site. She had chosen a slight rise where her grandmother's cabin once stood, offering natural drainage and morning sunlight. The area had been cleared, stones and roots removed painstakingly over several days. From her makeshift toolbox, a plastic storage container, Sarah withdrew a string, wooden stakes, and her most precious tool acquisition, a spirit level found at the dump, its bubble still functioning perfectly despite the cracked casing. "Square and level," she repeated, remembering the mantra from her research. "Everything depends on a proper foundation." She marked the corners of her planned 12 by 16 structure, measuring diagonally to ensure perfect right angle. 3 times she reset the stakes, checking and rechecking measurements. By mid-morning, when the sun had burned away the mist, she had a perfect rectangle marked on the ground. Next came the concrete blocks, 24 of them, laboriously hauled from town over several trips. They would serve as piers, supporting the floor joists at regular intervals. Each needed to be precisely leveled and aligned. Sarah dug shallow holes for each pier location, tamping the soil firm with the end of a log. She placed the first concrete block, checked it with her level, and felt a surge of satisfaction when the bubble centered perfectly. 1 down, 23 to go. By midday, her back ached and her hands were blistered, but 6 piers stood in perfect alignment. She rested in the shade, drinking water and contemplating her progress. A movement at the edge of the clearing caught her attention. Elijah stood there, observing her work with an unreadable expression. "They'll shift with frost if you don't go below the freeze line," he finally commented. Sarah sighed. She'd read about frost lines, but had hoped the pier foundation would be sufficient. "How deep is the freeze line here?" 18 inches, give or take. Her heart sank. Digging 24 holes, 18 inches deep in this rocky soil seemed impossible alone. Elijah studied her face, then the piers she'd placed. "Other way is to dig 4 holes for the corners. Rest can sit on grade if you add cross-bracing." Hope flickered. "4 holes I can manage," He nodded, then surprised her by adding, "Got a post-hole digger you can borrow? Easier than a shovel." The tool appeared at the property edge that evening, old but functional, with a note scrawled in pencil, "Return when done." The next morning brought another bout of sickness, but Sarah pushed through, determined. The post-hole digger made the work possible, though still grueling. She dug the corner holes to the required depth, refilled them partially with gravel scavenged from the roadside, and set concrete blocks stacked too high. The remaining blocks she placed according to her plan, arranging them in a grid that would support the floor joists. Each was leveled meticulously using shims made from scrap wood, checked and rechecked with her trusty spirit level. Rain interrupted her work on the third day, a sudden downpour that sent her scrambling for the shelter of her tent. She watched anxiously as water flowed across her building site, testing her drainage plan. To her relief, it functioned as intended, the water channeling away from her foundation piers. When the storm passed, she emerged to find Elijah standing at the edge of her property again, silently assessing her work. "Will it hold?" she asked. He considered the foundation grid. "If you use proper joist hangers and cross-brace the corners." "I've got joist hangers," she replied, gesturing to a coffee can filled with metal brackets salvaged from the construction site dumpster. Elijah nodded, the closest thing to approval he seemed capable of showing. "Winter's still coming hard." "I'll be ready," she answered, the phrase becoming a mantra between them. That evening, Sarah sat in her tent, sketching the next phase, the floor structure. Her foundation was complete, a humble grid of concrete blocks that represented her first tangible progress. She placed her hand on her growing belly. "We've got a foundation," she told her baby. "Now we need a floor." The spirit level rested beside her sleeping bag, its simple function to ensure things were straight and true, taking on an almost talismanic quality. In a world that had tilted sideways for her, the level represented stability, correctness, things being as they should. She kept it close, like a promise that everything else in her life would eventually find its proper balance too. The floor joists went in more easily than Sarah expected. Using lumber salvaged from the construction site and disassembled pallets, she created a sturdy grid atop her foundation piers. Each board was secured with joist hangers, the metal brackets keeping everything aligned. Cross-bracing added rigidity, just as Elijah had suggested. Plywood for the subfloor had been her biggest challenge. New sheets were prohibitively expensive, and used ones rarely came intact. She'd finally pieced together a patchwork from partial sheets and sturdy pallet tops, securing each section meticulously until she had a complete floor, not pretty but solid underfoot. Standing on the finished floor for the first time, Sarah felt a surge of accomplishment. 16 weeks after arriving, she had created the first real part of her home, a platform raised above the damp earth, level and strong. That night, she moved her tent onto the subfloor, the small luxury of sleeping on a flat, dry surface, bringing tears to her eyes. Now came the walls. Her research showed traditional stud framing was simplest, vertical 2x4s spaced 16 inches apart, with top and bottom plates to connect them, but her collection of full-length 2x4s was limited, and her growing belly made handling long boards increasingly difficult. She started with the shortest wall first, 12 feet long with a window opening in the center. Lying on the subfloor, she assembled the wall flat, nailing the pieces together as she'd seen in library books. When finished, she stared at the wall frame with a mixture of pride and anxiety. It needed to be lifted into place and secured, a task that required strength and leverage she wasn't sure she possessed. After an hour of failed attempts that left her sweating and frustrated, Sarah sat on the subfloor, hands pressed against her lower back. Her baby, now 22 weeks along, shifted inside her as if registering protest at her exertions. "Problem?" The voice startled her. Elijah stood at the edge of the subfloor, his weathered face unreadable. Sarah gestured to the wall frame. "Too heavy to lift alone." He nodded, considering the structure. Speaking, he stepped onto the subfloor, tested the wall's weight with his hands, then looked at her expectantly. "You take that end." Together, they raised the wall frame upright. Sarah held it steady while Elijah secured it temporarily with braces. The process repeated for the second short wall, then the longer 16-foot sections. By sunset, the basic frame stood, 4 walls defining the space that would become her home. "Needs windows for cross-ventilation," Elijah commented, his first words in hours. "Summer gets hot." Sarah showed him the 3 windows she'd collected, double-hung units discarded during a bank renovation. "Here, here, and there." She pointed to spaces left in the framing. He nodded approval. "Storm coming tomorrow. Best get a tarp over it." The next morning, Sarah worked through her nausea, attaching salvaged plywood to the exterior wall studs. Each piece required cutting to fit around window openings, a challenging task with only a handsaw. Her progress was slow, but steady. By noon, dark clouds gathered. Sarah hurried to cover her work with the blue tarp, securing it just as the first drops fell. From her tent on the subfloor, protected now by partial walls and tarp roof, she watched the storm rage, grateful for the rudimentary shelter already provided by her work. When the rain cleared, she found 3 windows standing upright against a tree near her building site. No sign of Elijah, but his message was clear. The windows she'd collected had been too heavy for her to move alone. Installing them required precision she wasn't sure she possessed. Each window needed to be level and plumb in its rough opening, then secured and flashed to prevent water infiltration. After studying her carpentry books one more time, she began with the smallest window. Her first attempt left gaps that would surely leak. She removed it, adjusted the rough opening, and tried again. The second attempt was better, but still imperfect. On the third try, with improvised shims cut from cedar shingles found at the dump, she achieved a satisfactory fit. "Not perfect, but it'll work," she told her baby, patting her rounded belly. "Like us." Each subsequent window went in more easily as she developed technique. When the final window was secured, she stepped back to admire the transformation. Light now entered her structure, the glass reflecting the surrounding trees. What had been a skeletal frame began to look like a genuine dwelling. Interior walls came next, more salvaged plywood, some drywall pieces she'd carefully transported in her wagon. The surfaces weren't perfect. Mismatched materials created an unplanned patchwork, but every secured panel enclosed the space further, creating a barrier between her and the elements. One evening, as Sarah hammered the last section of interior wall covering into place, she felt a different sensation, a distinct flutter, then a definite kick from within. She froze, hammer in mid-swing, as the movement repeated. "You approve?" she asked softly, pressing her palm against the spot. Another kick answered her. She looked around at what she'd accomplished. Walls enclosing a space, windows letting in light, a floor supporting her weight. Not yet a proper home, but no longer just a dream either. Through the western window, now trimmed with salvaged molding, the sunset painted her unfinished walls in golden light. The reclaimed windows, once discarded, now central to her home's character, transformed the simple space with their varied sizes and styles. Like her, they had been rejected, then found new purpose. The pickup truck slowed as it passed the overgrown driveway, its occupants craning their necks to glimpse what lay beyond the trees. Sarah, balancing on a salvaged stepladder while securing exterior wall sheathing, froze like a deer in headlights. The truck lingered, then continued down the road. It was the third vehicle that week to show unusual interest in her property. Later, at the hardware store where she'd gone to purchase her one extravagance, a proper locking doorknob, the cashier's eyes widened in recognition. "You're the pregnant lady building a house in the woods, aren't you?" Sarah nodded hesitantly, counting out dollars from her dwindling funds. "My brother Miguel helps at the construction site. Said you've been salvaging their scraps." The young woman leaned forward. "Is it true you're doing all the work yourself?" "Mostly," Sarah answered, uncomfortable with the attention. "I've had some help, Word had spread through Pinecrest like wildfire. The pregnant stranger building a home from discards had become the town's most intriguing topic of conversation. Some admired her determination, others questioned her judgment. At the library, Marge pulled her aside. "People are talking, Sarah. Some are concerned. About what? A woman in your condition, living rough, no utilities." Marge's eyes were kind, but worried. "Mrs. Patterson from the church board was asking if you need assistance." Sarah stiffened. "I'm managing fine. I know, dear. I told her you're as capable as your grandmother was." Marge hesitated. "But winter's coming, and with the baby due—" "I'll be ready," Sarah said, the phrase now automatic. The structure is nearly enclosed. Walking home that afternoon, Sarah sensed she was being watched more intently than usual. Two older women on a porch whispered as she passed. A man unloading groceries paused to stare openly at her and her wagon of salvaged materials. Rounding the bend toward her property, she spotted a sheriff's cruiser parked at her makeshift driveway entrance. A uniformed officer stood conferring with Elijah, who looked more uncomfortable than usual with human interaction. Sarah approached cautiously, heart pounding. The officer turned, young, maybe 30, with a carefully neutral expression. "Miss Matthews, I'm Deputy Collins. Mind if I have a word? Is there a problem?" "Just a welfare check. We received some concerns about your living situation." His eyes moved past her to the partially constructed cabin visible through the trees. "My situation is fine," Sarah said firmly. "You're living in a tent while pregnant and building a structure without permits," he noted, tone professional but not unkind. "The structure is under the square footage requiring permits in this county. I checked the regulations at the library." The deputy raised an eyebrow, seemingly impressed by her research. "Mind if I take a look around?" Sarah led him to her construction site, explaining her progress, the solar-charged battery system for minimal electricity, her rainwater collection plans. The deputy took notes, occasionally asking questions about her timeline, her plans for winter, her due date, and medical care. He inquired, "I have appointments at the county clinic. The next one's Thursday." When they reached the nearly enclosed structure, the deputy walked around it slowly, examining her work with a professional eye. "You've done all this yourself?" "Miss Tanner has helped with the heavy lifting," Sarah acknowledged, nodding toward Elijah, who hovered at the edge of the clearing. "And I've had some anonymous assistance." This was true. Twice in the past week, she'd discovered building supplies at the edge of her property, a box of roofing nails, a roll of house wrap, with no indication of the donor. The deputy completed his inspection and faced her. "I can't say this is an ideal situation, Matthews, but I don't see any legal reason to intervene. You're clearly resourceful." He handed her a card. "Call if you need anything. Cell reception is spotty but should work from the main road." After he left, Sarah sank onto a stump, relief making her lightheaded. "Town's curious about you," Elijah commented, breaking his usual silence. "They should mind their own business. Small town, you are their business now." He shifted uncomfortably. "Church ladies asking about helping you." Sarah sighed. The idea of becoming a charity case made her stomach clench. "I don't need help." Elijah's weathered face crinkled slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. "Didn't say you did," said they're asking. The next morning, Sarah found a brown paper bag at the edge of her property. Inside, a box of nails, exactly the size she needed for the roof sheathing, and a jar of homemade preserves. No note, no clue to the giver. She stared at the anonymous gift, emotions conflicted. Her fierce independence warred with practical necessity. The nails would save her precious dollars. The preserves would provide nutrition her simple diet lacked. As her baby shifted inside her, Sarah made a decision. She could accept assistance without becoming dependent. She could receive help while maintaining her agency. That afternoon, when she walked to town for her clinic appointment, she left a bunch of wildflowers at Elijah's mailbox, acknowledgement without words, gratitude without surrendering pride. At the clinic, the nurse took her blood pressure and frowned. "It's a bit elevated. You need to reduce stress." Sarah laughed softly. "I'm 6 months pregnant, building a house alone, and becoming the town curiosity. Stress is unavoidable, and shelter before winter is essential," the nurse acknowledged. "But you need support, Sarah. Let people help sometimes." Later, walking past the church, Sarah noticed women arranging items for what appeared to be a charity drive. One looked up, spotted her, and waved hesitantly. Sarah paused, then returned the wave. A small gesture, neither acceptance nor rejection, just acknowledgement that she existed within this community, however unconventionally. That night, using the new nails, she completed the roof sheathing that would keep rain from her nearly finished home. The anonymous gift had arrived precisely when needed most, like the universe offering quiet support for her determination. Sarah stared up at the rafters, calculating angles and weight distribution for what felt like the 100th time. The roof posed her greatest challenge yet. Unlike walls that could be assembled on the floor and raised, the roof required working overhead, increasingly difficult with her growing belly, throwing off her balance. Her research showed several options. Trusses would be strongest, but required precise cutting and assembly. A simple gabled roof would be easier, but needed adequate pitch for the frequent mountain rains. After much deliberation, she'd chosen a shed roof, a single slope from front to back, simpler to construct and requiring fewer materials. Using lumber salvaged from the construction site and pallets, she'd created most of the rafters. Each was a carefully measured puzzle of shorter pieces, sister-joined together. Not ideal but functional given her limited resources. Now came the daunting task of lifting and securing these rafters atop the wall plates. The first attempt left her exhausted and frustrated, the unwieldy beam slipping from her grasp before she could secure it. Elijah found her sitting on the subfloor, breathing heavily, eyes closed in concentration. "Roof time?" he asked, unnecessarily. Sarah nodded, too tired to maintain her usual independence. "I can't lift them high enough while keeping them straight." Without comment, Elijah examined her stack of homemade rafters. His weathered hands traced the joints, testing their stability. Finally, he nodded approval. "Need a pulley system, or another pair of hands?" Together they developed a workable method. Sarah would secure one end of a rafter to the lower wall while Elijah raised the other end to the higher wall. Between them they installed 6 rafters by sunset, creating the skeleton of her roof. "Rest now," Elijah advised, noting her exhaustion. "Storm coming tonight." Sarah eyed the open rafters anxiously. "I need to get some covering on it first." "Not tonight. You're done in." He was right. At 7 months pregnant, her body demanded rest more frequently, the baby within her seeming to grow heavier by the day. She reluctantly agreed to resume in the morning. That night, rain pounded her tarp-covered structure, finding every gap and seam. Water dripped steadily onto her tent, pooling on the tarp she'd stretched beneath her sleeping bag. By morning she was damp and chilled, more determined than ever to get proper roofing installed. To her surprise, Elijah arrived early, carrying an old blue tarp larger than any she possessed. Without discussion they secured it across the rafters, creating temporary protection while they worked. The next challenge was sheathing the roof. Plywood would be ideal, but she had only collected 3 partial sheets, not nearly enough. Creativity would be necessary. Old barn down valley was torn down last spring, Elijah mentioned casually. Metal roofing still piled behind it. Owner might sell cheap. The information was typical of Elijah, delivered without pressure, offering opportunity without charity. Sarah nodded gratefully. "Where exactly?" The farm's owner, a gruff woman in her 70s, looked skeptical when Sarah arrived with her wagon. "You're the one building alone? In your condition?" "Yes, ma'am. I heard you might have metal roofing available." The woman studied her thoughtfully. "My husband never threw anything away. Roofing's rusty in spots, but sound overall." She named a price lower than Sarah had dared hope. That's if you haul it yourself. Might be more than your little wagon can manage. I'll make multiple trips if necessary. The woman's weathered face softened slightly. My grandson's coming by tomorrow with his truck. Might be convinced to drop it at your place. Sarah swallowed her pride. That would be very helpful. 2 days later, a pickup arrived at her property, loaded with corrugated metal sheets in various conditions. The driver, a young man in his 20s, helped unload them without comment on her situation, a kindness Sarah deeply appreciated. Working with the metal roofing proved challenging. The sheets were heavy, the edges sharp, and precise overlap was essential to prevent leaks. Sarah fashioned makeshift scaffolding from salvaged lumber, creating platforms that allowed her to work more safely. Elijah appeared midway through the process, silently taking position on the opposite side of the roof. Together they secured the metal panels, working methodically from bottom to top. When rain threatened before they could finish, Sarah improvised with her collection of tarps, securing them where the metal sheets ended. The patchwork covering wasn't pretty, but it would keep the interior dry until they could complete the installation. That night, rain tested their work. Sarah lay in her tent, now positioned inside the nearly enclosed structure, listening intently for leaks. A few drips found their way through, but the majority of the size remained dry, her first night without the constant anxiety of exposure to the elements. The next morning she stood in the doorway, watching sunlight glint off the sections of metal roofing. The structure before her was no longer just a frame. It had become a genuine shelter. The roof, with its mismatched materials and imperfect seams, represented her greatest achievement yet. Her baby kicked vigorously, as if sensing her satisfaction. "Yes, I know," she murmured, hands cradling her belly. "We've got a roof over our heads." The tarp sections fluttered slightly in the breeze, bright blue against the weathered metal, a visible reminder of adaptability. What she couldn't accomplish perfectly, she'd managed practically. The temporary solutions weren't failures, but stepping stones. Someday, she promised herself, the entire roof would be properly finished. But for now, it would keep them dry through the approaching winter, and that was enough. The county clinic waiting room was worn but clean, posters about prenatal vitamins and childhood vaccinations decorating the walls. Sarah shifted uncomfortably on the plastic chair, her lower back aching from the morning's work installing door trim. At nearly 30 weeks pregnant, every physical task had become more challenging. "Sarah Matthews?" A nurse appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. In the examination room, Sarah answered the usual questions about fetal movement, sleep quality, and dietary habits. The nurse, Rita, according to her name tag, made notes with a neutral expression that gradually shifted to concern. "You're still camping while building?" she asked, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around Sarah's arm. "The structure is enclosed now. I've moved my tent inside." Rita pumped the cuff, listening through her stethoscope. "Your blood pressure's elevated again," she noted, removing the cuff. "And you've gained less weight than we'd like to see at this stage." Dr. Patel entered shortly after, reviewing Sarah's chart with a furrowed brow. His examination was thorough, but his frown deepened as he measured her fundal height. "The baby is measuring slightly small," he explained. "Not dangerously so, but combined with your blood pressure and minimal weight gain, I'm concerned about your living conditions." Sarah tensed. "I have shelter, food, and clean water. Building a house is strenuous work, especially in your 3rd trimester. You need more rest, more calories, and less physical strain." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I'm also concerned about your delivery plan. You're quite remote, yes, with limited transportation options." "I'm making arrangements," Sarah said, though in truth, she'd been avoiding this particular worry. Dr. Patel wrote a prescription for prenatal vitamins, then fixed her with a serious gaze. "Sarah, I need to be direct. If your next visit shows continued concerns, I may need to consult with social services about the welfare of you and your baby." Cold fear washed over her, Are you saying they could take my baby? I'm saying we need to ensure you both have adequate support for a healthy delivery and postnatal period. His tone softened. This isn't a threat, but medical concern. Please consider accepting more assistance. In the hallway after her appointment, Rita touched Sarah's arm lightly. Here, she said, pressing a pamphlet into Sarah's hand. The free clinic runs a prenatal support program. They can help with transportation to appointments, nutrition assistance, even temporary housing if needed. Sarah stared at the colorful brochure, emotions churning. Everything she'd done, every nail hammered, every board salvaged, had been to create independence, to build a home where no one could abandon her or her child again. The idea that this very effort might result in losing her baby was unthinkable. I'm not looking for handouts, she said stiffly. It's not charity, it's community, Rita corrected gently. No one does everything alone, especially not raising children. Walking back to her property, Sarah studied the pamphlet. Despite herself, the program offered practical support without removing agency, transportation vouchers, nutrition education, even doula services for delivery. Services designed to strengthen families, not separate them. The reality of her situation pressed down with new urgency. Her cabin, while enclosed, still lacked proper insulation, reliable heat, and basic amenities. Her diet consisted primarily of inexpensive staples: rice, beans, oatmeal, supplemented by the occasional gift of preserves or garden vegetables from anonymous community members. And her delivery date loomed just 10 weeks away. That evening, sitting on her newly installed plywood floor, Sarah made a list of essential tasks to create a minimally acceptable living situation: insulation, wood stove installation, basic plumbing, electricity, proper bed. The list was daunting, especially given her increasingly limited physical capabilities. A knock at her makeshift door, a salvaged hollow core secured with temporary hinges, startled her. No one ever knocked. Elijah simply appeared at the property edge when needed. Sarah opened the door to find Rita, the clinic nurse, holding a canvas bag. "Hope you don't mind," Rita said, taking in the cabin's interior with professional assessment. "I thought I'd drop these off on my way home." She handed Sarah the bag, which contained prenatal vitamins, iron supplements, and several packages of high-protein foods. "The clinic didn't have your prescription ready until after you left," Rita explained, though they both knew this visit extended beyond professional obligation. Sarah hesitated, then stepped back. "Would you like to come in? It's not much yet, but..." Rita entered, her gaze sweeping over the progress. Installed windows, partial insulation, the tent still serving as sleeping quarters in one corner. "You've done remarkable work," she said sincerely. "But you're racing against 2 clocks now. Winter and delivery." "I'm aware," Sarah replied, unconsciously resting one hand on her rounded belly. "The program I mentioned," Rita began. "I'll consider it," Sarah interrupted. "But this is our home. I won't give it up." Rita nodded, understanding. "No one's asking you to. But accepting help to make it safer isn't failure, Sarah." She glanced at the wood stove, sitting uninstalled in the corner. "Is that your heating solution?" "Once I get it properly vented, yes. My husband's a contractor. He could help install that safely, critical for carbon monoxide prevention with a newborn." The offer hung in the air between them. Sarah's instinct to refuse battled with Dr. Patel's warnings and the reality of her dwindling timeline. "I can pay something," she finally said. Rita smiled. "Start by taking better care of yourself. Eat these protein bars, take your vitamins and rest more. That's payment enough." After Rita left, Sarah sat on her sleeping bag, the pamphlet and nutritional supplements beside her. The baby shifted within, a forceful kick against her ribs, as if registering an opinion on the matter. "I know," she whispered. "We need help." The admission felt less like defeat than evolution. The goal had never been isolation, but self-sufficiency within a community. Perhaps accepting targeted assistance now would enable greater independence later. Sarah carefully placed the clinic pamphlet with her building plans. Another resource, another tool for creating the home her child deserved. With the exterior sealed against the elements, Sarah turned her attention inward. The interior of her small cabin was a blank canvas, rough walls waiting for insulation, bare subfloor, exposed ceiling rafters. Though modest in size, the space would need distinct areas for sleeping, cooking, and living. Rita's husband, Jim, had indeed come to install the wood stove, bringing his expertise and proper venting material. The black cast iron stove, salvaged from the town dump and painstakingly restored by Sarah, now stood proudly on a hearth of salvaged brick. Its first fire had filled the cabin with warmth that penetrated Sarah's bones, a comfort she hadn't experienced since leaving her apartment months ago. "Baby needs warm air and warm food," Elijah had commented on one of his increasingly frequent visits, eyeing the wood stove with approval. Insulation came next, a patchwork of solutions based on availability rather than convention. Rigid foam board salvaged from a renovation project covered most walls, supplemented with stuffed newspaper where gaps appeared. In the ceiling, Sarah carefully installed fiberglass bats donated by Jim, who had ordered too many for another project. She recognized the fiction for what it was, kindness disguised as coincidence, and accepted the gift with quiet gratitude. The physical limitations of late pregnancy forced adaptations to her work style. Tasks that required reaching overhead were done early in the day when her energy was highest. She worked in shorter bursts, resting between effort. Simple tools became extensions of her body. A broomstick with a nail at the end helped position ceiling insulation. A garden kneeler salvaged from a yard sale eased the strain of low work. Each night, Sarah collapsed into her tent, still pitched in one corner of the increasingly habitable space, her body aching but her mind cataloging progress and planning next steps. The division of the interior evolved naturally. The wood stove claimed one wall, its heat distribution dictating the location of her sleeping area nearby. A collection of wooden crates, stacked and secured, became a rudimentary kitchen counter along the opposite wall. Between them, a space for sitting and eventually for her child to play. When Miguel from the construction site arrived unexpectedly one Saturday with scraps of vinyl flooring, Sarah felt a surge of unexpected emotion. The grey faux wood pattern wasn't what she would have chosen, but laid over her plywood subfloor, it transformed the space instantly, from construction site to home. Just leftovers from the bank job. Miguel insisted, helping her measure and cut the pieces to fit around the wood stove hearth. Would have gone to the dump anyway. That night, Sarah dismantled her tent for the final time. Using the rainproof material as temporary curtains for the windows, she reclaimed the tent floor as a sleeping mat. Her sleeping bag, laid out flat on the newly installed flooring, became her first proper bed in her new home. The ceiling remained her greatest challenge. Exposed rafters and metal roofing made for poor insulation and constant noise when rain fell. Sarah's solution came from the stack of flattened cardboard boxes she'd collected, nailed carefully to the underside of the rafters and painted with leftover white primer. They created a crude but effective ceiling that brightened the space considerably. Her most meaningful project emerged on a rainy afternoon, when physical fatigue forced a break from practical tasks. Using salvaged pine boards too small for structural purposes, Sarah began constructing a crib. Each piece was sanded smooth by hand, corners rounded carefully, the design simple but sturdy. As her belly had grown, her movements had slowed, but her sense of purpose had only sharpened. "This is for you," she told her unborn child, as she worked, fitting the pieces together with glue and dowels rather than nails for added safety. "Your first real furniture." The crib took shape over several days, becoming both practical necessity and symbolic milestone. Sarah positioned it along the wall near where she slept, its presence transforming the space into a nursery as well as a home. Light fixtures were beyond her current capabilities, so Sarah created alternatives. Mason jars fitted with solar-charged LED lights, strategically placed on shelves and counters. The gentle illumination they provided felt almost magical in the evenings, casting soft shadows across her handcrafted walls. On a particularly productive day, Sarah stood in the center of her nearly finished interior, turning slowly to take it all in. Insulated walls now covered with salvaged beadboard and mismatched paneling, the wood stove radiating steady heat. Her sleeping area defined by a second-hand rug and the repurposed tent floor. The cooking corner with its crate cabinets and a 2-burner camp stove, and the crib, waiting patiently for its occupant. None of it matched. Nothing was perfect. The materials were second-hand, the craftsmanship sometimes crude, but standing there, hands supporting her lower back against the strain of her 8th month of pregnancy, Sarah felt something profound. The space held coherence beyond its components. It had become more than shelter, it had become home. That evening, as she heated a simple stew on the wood stove, a knock came at her door, still temporary, but functional with a proper latch installed. Rita stood there, holding a small package. "Housewarming," she explained, stepping inside and surveying the transformation with evident surprise. "Sarah, this is wonderful." The gift was a handmade quilt, not new, but lovingly mended, sized perfectly for a crib. "It was my daughter's," Rita explained. "I thought your little one might enjoy it too." Sarah draped the colorful quilt over the side of the crib, its cheerful pattern bringing the simple pine construction to life. Something inside her shifted and settled, like the baby finding a more comfortable position. "It's perfect," she said softly, running her fingers over the stitches that connected one generation to the next. "Thank you." First frost arrived overnight, painting delicate white patterns on the windows and stiffening the ground beneath Sarah's feet as she ventured outside to collect water from her rain barrel. Inside, the wood stove had kept her cabin surprisingly cozy, but the morning chill served as a stark reminder. Winter was coming quickly, and her preparations remained incomplete. At 32 weeks pregnant, her movements had slowed considerably. The baby had settled low in her pelvis, a constant presence that affected her balance and endurance. Simple tasks now required deliberate planning. Complex ones demanded assistance she was still learning to accept. Sarah consulted the list taped beside her: makeshift kitchen area, weatherproof door, collect firewood, install shelving, create food storage, finish water system. The list seemed to grow rather than shrink, despite her constant efforts. The door was her most pressing concern. The temporary solution, a hollow core interior door salvaged from a renovation, provided privacy but little insulation against the deepening cold. Sarah had researched how to build a proper insulated exterior door, but the materials and tools required exceeded her current resources. As she pondered this problem over a breakfast of oatmeal, a now familiar knock sounded. "Morning," Elijah said when she opened the door, his breath visible in the crisp air. "Brought you something." Behind him stood his ancient truck, its bed containing an exterior door, solid wood with a small glass panel, weathered but sturdy. "Neighbor replaced theirs," he explained with characteristic brevity. "Thought you might use it." Together they removed her temporary door and fitted the new one, Elijah quietly showing her how to properly hang and seal it against drafts. The immediate difference was palpable, a substantial barrier between her growing sanctuary and the increasingly hostile element. "Thank you," Sarah said when they finished, the words inadequate for the mixture of gratitude and humility she felt. Elijah nodded, then gestured to the woods beyond her clearing. "Need to talk about firewood." They walked together to the edge of her property, where he pointed out dead standing trees suitable for harvest. "These first," he instructed. "Already seasoned. Green wood makes smoke, not heat." The lesson continued as he demonstrated how to identify appropriate trees, explained the best cutting techniques for her limited strength, and showed her how to split logs with the maul he'd brought along. "Stack against south wall," he advised. "Morning sun dries any moisture. Keep covered, but with airflow." By the end of the morning, Sarah had a modest pile of cut wood and blistered hands despite the work gloves Rita had given her. Elijah promised to return with his chainsaw on the weekend to help build her supply further. As October deepened toward November, the community's involvement in Sarah's project grew increasingly overt. The pretense of coincidental assistance faded as winter's threat loomed larger than concerns about her independence. Marge from the library arrived with books on winter gardening and food preservation, along with a box of canned goods left over from the church food drive. Miguel and two other construction workers spent a Sunday installing proper gutters and downspouts, connecting them to her rain barrels and showing her how to prevent freezing. Even the skeptical Mrs. Patterson from the church board made an appearance, bringing hand-knitted baby blankets and winter maternity clothes, discovered during the rummage sale sorting. "We're not interfering," she stated firmly when Sarah began to protest. "We're being neighbors." The woodpile against Sarah's south wall grew steadily taller, contributions appearing mysteriously when she was at appointments or working inside. Elijah never mentioned these community additions to their joint efforts, but his knowing glance told Sarah he was well aware of the collective project her firewood supply had become. Inside, Sarah focused on creating storage and organization that would make the winter months manageable. Shelves constructed from salvaged lumber lined the walls, holding her modest but growing collection of essentials, canned foods, medical supplies, baby items gradually accumulated through the clinic's support program. Under the kitchen counter, she installed a simple dry sink, a basin with a drainage pipe leading outside that would allow basic washing until she could implement a more sophisticated water system. A large pot kept on the wood stove provided warm water for bathing and cleaning. The physical limitations of late pregnancy forced creative solutions. When she could no longer safely climb to reach high shelves, Sarah rearranged her storage store for accessibility. When splitting kindling became too strenuous, she devised a seated method that protected her straining back. Each adaptation was a conversation with her body and her environment, finding the balance between necessity and capability, between independence and safety. As the first snow flurries danced outside her windows, Sarah sat beside her wood stove, hands resting on her rounded belly, surveying her creation. The cabin was far from perfect. Uneven floors, mismatched materials, improvised solutions visible everywhere. But it was solid. It was warm. It was hers. The baby shifted beneath her hands, a rolling movement that still startled her despite its familiarity. "I know," she murmured. "It's not what I planned either, but we'll be warm and dry, and that's what matters." Through her window she could see the substantial woodpile, now covered with a tarp secured against wind. More than fuel for her stove, it represented the community she'd reluctantly allowed into her life. Each log a small act of faith in her project, in her capability, in her future. Winter was coming, but for the first time since Jack's departure, Sarah faced the changing season without fear. She had built more than shelter. She had created a place to welcome her child, to begin their life together. "We're ready," she told her baby, as the snow began to fall in earnest, blanketing her clearing in pristine white. "Or as ready as we'll ever be." Sarah was arranging her meager pantry supplies when she noticed the car parked at the end of her driveway. Unlike the usual pickup trucks and weathered sedans that occasionally appeared, this was a newer model with the local newspaper's logo on the door. A woman approached, notebook in hand, her city clothes marking her as an outsider, almost as clearly as her purposeful stride. Sarah tensed, one hand automatically moving to her belly in a protective gesture. "Miss Matthews? I'm Diane Weber, from the Pinecrest Gazette." The woman smiled professionally. "I was hoping for a few minutes of your time." Sarah frowned. "I'm not interested in being interviewed. The community's been talking about your project for months." Diane gestured toward the cabin. "A pregnant woman building her own home from salvaged materials? That's a remarkable story." "It's my life, not a story," Sarah countered, but invited the reporter in despite her misgivings. The November chill made standing in the doorway uncomfortable, and her back had been aching persistently since morning. Inside, Diane's eyes widened as she took in the small but functional space, the wood stove radiating heat, the handmade furnishings, the carefully organized storage solutions. "You've done all this yourself?" The professional detachment in her voice gave way to genuine astonishment. With some help, Sarah acknowledged, thinking of Elijah's quiet guidance and the community's increasing support. The questions came rapidly after that. How had she learned construction? Where had she found materials? What had driven her to take on such a project while pregnant? How had she managed the physical challenges? Sarah answered carefully, emphasizing the practical aspects rather than the personal circumstances that had led her here. She mentioned her grandmother's legacy, her research at the library, the unexpected kindness of neighbors, but kept Jack's abandonment and her financial desperation private. "May I take some photos?" Diane asked when their conversation wound down. Sarah hesitated, uncomfortable with the attention but recognizing an opportunity. On one condition, mention that most materials were salvaged or donated. Others might be inspired to see possibility in what's discarded. 2 days later, the article appeared on the front page of the local weekly Mountain Mom-to-Be Builds Home from Scratch. The photo showed Sarah standing proudly beside her small cabin, hand resting on her prominent belly, expression serious but determined. The story emphasized her resourcefulness and the community's gradual rally around her project. The impact was immediate and unexpected. Sarah's private endeavor became public overnight. People she'd never met greeted her in town. Vehicles slowed as they passed her property, occupants craning to glimpse the now famous cabin in the woods. The attention was uncomfortable, but brought surprising benefits. A local hardware store owner offered her store credit for consulting on our upcycling workshop. The construction company that had previously turned her away called offer surplus materials from completed projects. Even the skeptical deputy who had performed the welfare check stopped by to compliment her progress. Most significantly, an email arrived via the library's computer. A small environmental non-profit wanted to document her use of reclaimed materials as part of their sustainable housing initiative. They offered a modest stipend for her participation and consultation. "It's not charity," Marge emphasized when Sarah expressed hesitation. "It's recognition of your expertise. You've created something valuable here, not just a structure, but knowledge." Sarah stared at the email, emotions conflicted. She had begun this project to create independence, to build something that couldn't be taken from her. Now, paradoxically, her fiercely private endeavor had connected her more deeply to the wider world. The stipend would provide critical financial breathing room as her due date approached. With careful budgeting, it would cover the solar panel kit she'd been researching and basic supplies for the baby's first months. Yet accepting it meant embracing her new public identity as the Mountain Mom-to-Be from the newspaper article. That evening, as she carefully fed her wood stove, Sarah contemplated how her perception of self-reliance had evolved. True independence, she was learning, didn't mean refusing all assistance or connection. It meant building a life where support was reciprocal rather than one-sided, where vulnerability could coexist with strength. The baby kicked vigorously, as if emphasizing this point. "I know," she murmured, "we're not alone anymore. That's probably for the best." She composed her acceptance email the next day at the library, formally agreeing to share her story and knowledge with the nonprofit. As she typed, she realized she was no longer simply building shelter, but contributing to a larger conversation about resourcefulness, community, and creative problem-solving. On her way home, Sarah stopped at the post office to check her rarely used box. Among the flyers and junk mail was a forwarded letter from her old address, an official-looking envelope from a record company. Inside was a royalty check for Jack's band, pitifully small but bearing his name. Sarah stared at it, a strange calm settling over her. The check represented everything she'd left behind: uncertainty, dependence, waiting for someone else to determine her future. She slipped it into her pocket, planning to forward it to his last known address. Unlike months before, Seeing his name no longer triggered pain or longing, just a distant recognition of a path not taken. At her cabin, Sarah found a delivery waiting, lumber precisely cut for shelving, with a note from Jim, Rita's husband. Thought you might use these for the baby's things. The thoughtfulness of it, not just materials, but consideration for her specific needs, brought unexpected tears. That night, working by lamplight, Sarah installed the shelves near the crib, creating a changing station and storage for the baby items gradually accumulating through the clinic support program and community gifts. The newspaper article, folded carefully and tucked among her building plans, had become a milestone marking the transition from isolation to integration. The cabin remained her creation, her achievement, but its story now belonged partly to the community that had gradually embraced both it and her. At 36 weeks pregnant, Sarah's world narrowed to the distance between her increasingly persistent contractions. Braxton Hicks, the clinic had assured her, practice contractions, not the real thing. Still, their frequency served as a constant reminder of her approaching due date and the preparation still needed. Birth plan, Rita emphasized during Sarah's weekly checkup, handing her a printed form. You need to think through your options and preference. Sarah stared at the document, overwhelmed by its implications. Hospital or birthing center? Pain management preferences? Who would be present? Transportation plan? Each question underscored the reality she'd been too busy building to fully contemplate. Soon she would be bringing a new life into the world. I haven't thought much beyond having a roof overhead, she admitted. Rita's expression softened. That's why we're doing this now. Let's start with the practical aspects. How will you get to the hospital when labor begins? This at least had a straightforward answer. The clinic's prenatal support program had connected Sarah with a volunteer driver network for medical appointments. One call would bring transportation within 30 minutes, assuming phone service was available. I've been researching options, Sarah explained. The prepaid cell phone has spotty reception at my property, but works reliably at the main road. I've timed the walk 12 minutes at my current pace. Rita nodded approvingly, but frowned at the mention of the walk. And if labor progresses quickly or weather is bad? The question highlighted gaps in Sarah's planning. Her fierce independence had served her well in building shelter, but childbirth would require different preparations, contingencies for scenarios beyond her control. That evening, Sarah spread the birth plan document on her small table, filling it out methodically. Hospital open to pain management if needed. No specific birth preferences except basic dignity and informed consent. Primary contact, Rita, who had volunteered to be her support person if labor began during her off hours. As she wrote, the reality of her situation settled more deeply. Her baby would be born into this small cabin, not in the physical sense, but in the broader reality of the life they would share here. Every decision she made now would shape that life. The following days brought a flurry of activity focused on final preparations. Sarah installed a simple rainwater collection system that could be accessed from inside during winter weather. She organized baby supplies received through the clinic's program and community gifts, diapers, wipes, tiny clothes sorted by size, a second-hand bassinet delivered anonymously after the newspaper article appeared. Transportation remained her greatest concern. The volunteer driver program was reliable, but not immediate, and winter weather in the mountains could make her road impassable with little warning. Sarah needed a backup plan. Elijah provided the solution during one of his increasingly frequent visits, bringing split firewood to add to her substantial pile. Got a CB radio, he mentioned casually. Old, but works. Could teach you the emergency channel. The radio appeared the next day, bulky by modern standards but functional, with a handwritten channel guide taped to the back. Elijah spent an hour showing Sarah how to operate it, explaining which frequencies were monitored by emergency services and which by locals like himself. Always someone listening, he assured her. Day or night, the device took a place of honor near her bed, its presence oddly comforting. A direct line to help that required no walking to the main road, no cell service, no dependency on weather conditions. Water became her next focus. The rain barrel system worked for cleaning and bathing, but Sarah needed reliable drinking water. Jim, Rita's husband, arrived one Saturday with filtration equipment salvaged from a cabin renovation. Filters the sediment and most contaminants, he explained, installing it on her primary barrel. Still best to boil for drinking, but safer for everything else. As her due date approached, Sarah found herself drawn repeatedly to the small corner she'd prepared for her child, the handmade crib with its donated quilt, the changing area with carefully folded diapers, the bassinet positioned near her bed for nighttime feedings. These physical preparations grounded her when anxiety about the impending birth threatened to overwhelm. Dr. Patel noted her progress with approval during her 38-week appointment. Blood pressure's stabilized, weight gain is better, and the baby's growth has improved, he noted. Your living situation has clearly become more suitable. I had help, Sarah acknowledged. The admission coming more easily now. That's apparent from your birth plan as well, he observed. Good contingencies, realistic expectations. You've done your homework. The doctor's confidence bolstered Sarah's own. She had researched childbirth as methodically as she had studied construction techniques, preparing herself mentally as well as practically. The clinic had provided childbirth education classes, which she'd attended faithfully despite the transportation challenges. One suggestion, Dr. Patel added: pack 2 separate bags, one for a planned hospital arrival, one for an emergency situation. Keep the emergency one by your door with only the essentials. Sarah implemented this advice immediately upon returning home, organizing supplies into clearly labeled bags. The process felt like assembling necessary components, creating structure from potential chaos, preparing for various scenarios. A light December snow fell as she worked, the first significant accumulation of the season. Through her window, Sarah could see the white blanket transforming her property, softening the rough edges of her building site. The wood smoke from her stove rose in a straight column against the gray sky, a visible sign of the warmth and shelter she'd created. Inside, the cabin had evolved from mere construction project to genuine home. Curtains made from salvaged fabric softened the windows. A bookshelf held pregnancy and baby care guides alongside her construction manual. The wood stove maintained a steady warmth that penetrated the well-insulated walls, creating a cocoon of comfort against the winter chill. As evening fell, Sarah sat in the rocking chair, another community gift, completing the final item on her birth preparation list, a letter to her unborn child. In it, she documented the journey that had brought them to this moment, the challenges overcome, the home built board by board, with determination and eventually community. You were my motivation, she wrote, the reason I found strength I didn't know I possessed. This home is your birthright, not just the physical structure, but the knowledge that we can build what we need, even when it seems impossible. Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake a temporary visitor that would eventually give way to spring. Inside, Sarah rocked gently, hands cradling her full belly, no longer alone in her waiting. The storm warnings began on a Tuesday, crackling through the CB radio that had become Sarah's constant companion. Winter had settled firmly into the mountains, but this system promised to be exceptional. Heavy snow, freezing temperatures, high winds, the kind of weather that isolated rural communities for days. Sarah listened carefully to the broadcasts, mentally cataloging her supplies. Wood stacked high beside the stove, enough for at least 2 weeks. Food pantry organized and full, thanks to her careful budgeting of the non-profit stipend. Water barrels topped off from recent rain, protected against freezing by insulated covers. Jim had helped install. At 39 weeks pregnant, her due date loomed just 7 days away. The timing of the storm sparked a deep, primal anxiety that no amount of preparation could fully quell. You'll be fine, Rita assured her during a phone call from the clinic. First babies are usually late anyway, but charge that CB radio, just in case. As the first flakes began to fall Wednesday morning, Sarah completed her storm preparations. She filled every available container with filtered water, She positioned emergency supplies near the door, flashlights, extra blankets, her hospital bags. She stacked extra wood inside to keep it dry, making movement in the small cabin more challenging but ensuring accessible fuel. By afternoon, the snow fell in thick curtains, the wind driving it horizontally against her windows. The temperature dropped rapidly as darkness approached, the storm intensifying just as predicted. Sarah built up her fire and settled in, trying to quiet the worry that circled like the wind outside her walls. The cabin creaked and groaned under the storm's assault, but held firm. No leaks appeared in the roof she'd so carefully constructed. No drafts penetrated the insulation she'd meticulously installed. The wood stove maintained a steady warmth that testified to her proper venting and chimney work. Pride in these accomplishments provided some comfort as she listened to the howling wind. Her home, this structure built from discards and determination, was protecting her exactly as intended. The power grid failed around midnight, plunging the surrounding area into darkness. Sarah noticed only because the few distant lights visible from her windows disappeared. Her solar-charged lanterns and wood stove heat continued uninterrupted, her off-grid systems proving their worth. She slept fitfully, waking often to add wood to the stove and listen to the storm. Each time she rose, she noted the increasing depth of snow visible through her windows, illuminated by the strange half-light reflected from the white landscape. Dawn brought no respite. If anything, the storm had intensified. Snow now piled halfway up her windows on the windward side. The CB radio reported road closures throughout the county, emergency services operating on minimal staffing, power outages affecting thousands. Sarah maintained her routine despite the chaos outside, stoking the fire, preparing simple meals, reviewing her birth preparation materials. The enforced stillness gave her time to focus on the movements of her child, now positioned low in her pelvis, seemingly as ready as she was for their shared journey to advance to its next stage. The first contraction arrived mid-afternoon, a tightening across her lower back that she initially mistook for the persistent aches of late pregnancy. When it returned 20 minutes later, slightly stronger, she began timing, still irregular, still mild, but unmistakably different from the Braxton Hicks she'd experienced for weeks. Not yet, she told herself firmly. Not during this storm. By evening, the contractions had established a pattern, 15 minutes apart, lasting 30 seconds, gradually increasing in intensity. Still early labor, according to her research, but progressing steadily. Sarah forced herself to eat, despite her diminishing appetite, knowing she would need strength for what lay ahead. She keyed the CB radio, following the protocol Elijah had taught her. "This is Sarah Matthews on Matthews Property, Pine Ridge Road, requesting assistance. Early labor during storm over." The response came quickly, a dispatcher's calm voice, requesting details about her condition. Sarah provided the information methodically: contraction timing, water intact, no bleeding, baby moving normal. The dispatcher promised to alert the volunteer emergency response team and maintain contact. An hour passed with no further updates, the contractions continuing their inexorable progression. Now 10 minutes apart, each requiring focused breathing to manage. Sarah paced her small cabin between them, pausing to lean against walls or furniture when the tightening demanded her full attention. The radio crackled again finally. "Matthews Property. This is dispatch. Roads to your location are currently impassable for standard vehicles. Snow removal equipment is prioritizing main routes. Emergency response has been notified of your situation. Please update with any changes." Over. The clinical tone did nothing to mask the essential message. She was on her own, at least for now. Sarah acknowledged the transmission calmly, then allowed herself one moment of pure fear, before her pragmatic nature reasserted control. She had prepared for this possibility. The emergency birth kit from the clinic was organized and accessible. She had studied the basics of unassisted birth, though never imagining she would need to apply that knowledge. She had clean towels, sterile supplies, a clear understanding of when complications would require intervention regardless of circumstances. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before. As it peaked, a sharp crack from outside pierced the storm's constant roar. Through her window, Sarah saw a massive pine limb crash to the ground, severed by ice and wind. Relief flooded through her. It had missed her cabin and woodpile by mere feet. The near miss crystallized her situation. The storm presented dangers beyond her birth concerns. She needed assistance not just for delivery, but for basic safety. Her carefully constructed home provided shelter, but the situation demanded community. The CB radio offered her only connection to that community now. She keyed it again. Dispatch Sarah Matthews. Labor, progressing. Contractions 8 minutes apart. Tree limbs falling near property, requesting any possible assistance. Over. The response was immediate, but not from dispatch. A gruff, familiar voice broke through the static. Sarah, it's Elijah. I'm about half-mile from you with emergency equipment. Hold tight. Over. The hour that followed Elijah's radio message seemed eternal. Sarah moved between contractions, now 6 minutes apart, and demanding her full concentration. She positioned towels and emergency supplies near her bed, mentally reviewing the childbirth information she'd studied so diligently. The sound of an engine struggling through deep snow finally broke through the storm's howl. Through her frosted window, Sarah glimpsed headlights, not approaching on the road, but cutting directly through the woods, illuminating swirling snow between the trees. A few minutes later, a sharp knock preceded Elijah's entrance. Snow covered his heavy coat and boots, his weathered face reddened from cold and exertion. Behind him came a woman Sarah didn't recognize, carrying a large medical kit. Nancy Wilcox, the woman introduced herself briskly, shedding her outer layer. Retired midwife. Your neighbor called me when he heard your situation. She nodded toward Elijah, who was already stoking the wood stove to increase the cabin's warmth. Relief washed over Sarah, with an intensity that momentarily overshadowed her contraction pain. Thank you for coming, she managed. Nancy's experienced eyes assessed Sarah's condition and the cabin's suitability. You've prepared well, she noted approvingly. How far apart are the contractions now? About 6 minutes. Getting stronger. The retired midwife nodded. Still early stages. First babies usually take their time. She opened her kit, removing basic monitoring equipment. Let's see how things are progressing. After a thorough examination, Nancy confirmed what Sarah already sensed. Labor was advancing normally, but had hours yet to go. The baby's heartbeat was strong, position good, Sarah's vitals stable despite the stress of the situation. In ideal circumstances, we'd transport you to the hospital, Nancy explained. But with the roads as they are, she glanced at Elijah, who shook his head grimly. Got here on the old logging trails with the snow machine, he explained. Main roads are impassable. County says maybe tomorrow noon before plows reach this far. Nancy turned back to Sarah. I've attended hundreds of births. If you're comfortable with me assisting you here, I believe we can safely manage a normal delivery, but you should know your options. Sarah weighed the information as another contraction built and crested. The storm had made the decision for her. Transportation to the hospital was currently impossible. Yet the arrival of Elijah and Nancy transformed her isolated emergency into a supported birth with experienced help. I trust you, she said simply when the contraction passed. The hours that followed settled into a rhythm dictated by Sarah's labor. Nancy provided guidance and monitoring, her calm competence a steadying influence. Elijah maintained the fire and cleared a path to the outhouse, otherwise keeping a respectful distance while remaining available if needed. As midnight approached, the storm finally began to abate, the wind's howl diminishing to occasional gusts. Sarah's labor, however, intensified, contractions now 3 minutes apart and requiring all her concentration. You're doing wonderfully, Nancy encouraged. Transition stage now. The hardest part, but it means you're getting close. The next hours blurred in Sarah's memory afterward, pain unlike anything she'd experienced, interspersed with moments of clarity and determination. Nancy's steady voice guiding her, the warm security of her cabin enveloping them, the strange intimacy of bringing life into the world in this house she had built with her own hands. At 3:42 a.m. with a final tremendous effort, Sarah's daughter entered the world. Red-faced, indignant, perfectly formed, Nancy placed the infant on Sarah's chest, where tiny fingers splayed and a wavering cry announced her arrival. "Hello," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mum. We did it." Nancy efficiently handled the third stage of labor, ensuring the placenta delivered completely and checking Sarah for complications. Finding none, she helped clean and swaddle the newborn, then guided Sarah through the first feeding, the baby latching with surprising strength for one so new to the world. Outside, the storm had passed completely. Moonlight spilled through the windows, reflecting off the snow-covered landscape and filling the cabin with ethereal light. Elijah appeared briefly at the bedroom doorway. "Radio's working again," called the clinic. "They know you're safe." His eyes met Sarah's, a rare smile softening his features. "You've got a fine daughter." By dawn, the situation had stabilized. Sarah rested in her bed, her daughter sleeping beside her in the handmade crib temporarily moved to the bedside. Nancy had cleaned the birthing area and was preparing a light breakfast in the kitchenette. Through the windows, the rising sun transformed the snow-covered world into a dazzling panorama of white and gold. The CB radio crackled with updates on road clearing progress. Emergency services expected to reach their area by midday, with medical transport possible soon after. The county clinic had been notified of the birth and was preparing for their arrival once travel became possible. Sarah dozed intermittently, waking to check on her daughter with a sense of wonder that hadn't diminished. This child, conceived in one life and born into another entirely different one, represented everything she had fought for over the past month. Nancy approached with a cup of herbal tea. "You should try to rest while she's sleeping. You'll need your strength." Sarah accepted the tea gratefully. "I still can't believe she's here, that we're both okay." "You were prepared," Nancy replied simply. "The cabin, the supplies, the knowledge, you created everything needed for her safe arrival." Later that morning, the distant sound of snowplows announced the gradual restoration of connection to the outside world. By early afternoon, a county medical transport arrived, Rita accompanying the EMTs after insisting on joining them, despite not being on duty. "Oh, Sarah," Rita breathed, seeing the newborn. "She's beautiful. Are you both all right?" The examination confirmed what Nancy had already determined. Mother and baby were doing well despite the unplanned home birth. Nevertheless, transport to the hospital was recommended for a comprehensive checkup. As the EMTs prepared for transportation, Sarah looked around her small cabin, the space that had sheltered them through birth and storm, the home created from discarded materials and sheer determination. "I need to gather some things," she told Rita, who helped her pack essentials for their hospital stay. At the doorway, Sarah paused. Something about leaving, even temporarily, triggered an unexpected wave of emotions. This place had witnessed her transformation from abandoned and desperate to capable and strong. Its walls had absorbed her fears and now held the echo of her daughter's first cries. "We'll be back soon," she whispered to the empty room, a promise to the home and to herself. Outside, Elijah stood watching as the EMTs carefully helped Sarah and her bundled infant into the transport vehicle. Their eyes met briefly in wordless understanding, acknowledgement of a journey completed and another just beginning. "What's her name?" he asked quietly, the most personal question he had ever voiced. Sarah looked down at her daughter's face, peaceful in sleep despite the commotion around her. "Hope," she answered. "Her name is Hope." The hospital stay lasted 3 days, standard for a first-time mother, despite the uncomplicated delivery. Sarah found herself grateful for the rest, the meals prepared by others, the experienced nurses teaching her the rhythms of newborn care. Hope thrived under the watchful eyes of the pediatric staff, gaining weight and passing all newborn screenings with flying colors. Word of the dramatic storm birth spread quickly through Pinecrest. The newspaper ran a follow-up story. Mountain Mom delivers during blizzard in self-built cabin. By the time discharge day arrived, Sarah's small room overflowed with cards and modest gifts from townspeople she barely knew. "I've never seen anything like it," the discharge nurse commented, helping Sarah pack the unexpected bounty. "The whole town's adopted you too." Rita arrived to drive them home, her sedan loaded with supplies donated by clinic staff, diapers, formula for emergencies, a proper baby bathtub. The drive through newly plowed roads revealed the storm's intensity. Drifts still climbed halfway up roadside trees. Power crews worked on downed lines. Abandoned vehicles waited for retrieval from ditches. The cabin survived beautifully, Rita reported as they turned onto the forest road leading to Sarah's property. "Jim checked it yesterday. Said your construction held up better than some professional jobs in town." Approaching her clearing, Sarah gasped. The driveway had been completely cleared of snow, wide enough for easy access. Wood had been stacked neatly on the porch, protected from the elements. A handmade sign hung above her door, "Welcome home, Hope." Inside, the transformation continued. The cabin was spotlessly clean, the wood stove radiating steady heat. Fresh curtains hung at the windows. On the small kitchen table stood a wicker basket filled with meals in labeled containers, each with reheating instructions attached. A second basket held essential baby supplies organized by type. "Who did all this?" Sarah asked, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness evident in every detail. "Everyone," Rita answered simply. "The church ladies organized it, but people from all over town contributed. They wanted to give you and Hope a proper homecoming." Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she surveyed the space, her hard-won shelter now infused with community care. The independent life she had fought to build had expanded to include something she hadn't initially sought: belonging. In the days that followed, Sarah established new routines centered around Hope's needs. The newborn schedule dictated everything: feeding, sleeping, rare moments of quiet when Sarah could attend to cabin maintenance or her own basic needs. The community support proved invaluable during this adjustment period. The prepared meals meant one less task. The organized supplies reduced stress. The knowledge that help was just a call away provided security. Visitors came regularly but respectfully. Marge from the library brought books on infant development and offered to hold Hope while Sarah showered. Miguel and his wife delivered a handmade wooden rocking horse for when she's bigger. Even Miss Patterson, initially skeptical of Sarah's unconventional living situation, appeared with a church quilt group, each member having contributed squares to a blanket embroidered with Hope's name and birth date. Most frequent was Elijah, though his visits maintained their characteristic brevity. He would appear at the edge of the clearing, split wood for an hour, without conversation, then depart with minimal words. Yet Sarah noticed subtle changes in his manner. Occasionally he would accept a cup of coffee, ask gruffly about Hope's growth, or mention improvements he thought the cabin might need before the next winter. As spring approached, Sarah's focus expanded beyond immediate survival to longer-term planning. The non-profit that had documented her building process renewed its interest after Hope's birth, proposing a more extensive case study of sustainable, low-cost housing. The stipend they offered would allow Sarah to implement improvements: proper plumbing, expanded solar power, insulation upgrades, while sharing her knowledge with others in similar circumstances. The most surprising development came from the local community college. After reading about Sarah's project, their sustainability program director reached out with a proposal. Would she consider teaching a workshop on reclaimed building materials? The position would be part-time, allowing her to bring Hope along, and would provide steady income while honoring her hard-won expertise. "You've become something of a local legend," the director explained during his visit to the cabin. People are inspired by what you've accomplished with so little. Sarah looked around her small home, seeing it suddenly through others' eyes, not as a desperate measure born of necessity, but as a creative achievement worth emulating. The mismatched windows that admitted spring sunshine, the walls assembled from discarded materials, now painted a cheerful yellow, the roof that had sheltered her daughter's birth during a historic blizzard. "I'm not sure I'm qualified to teach," she admitted. "I learned as I went, made plenty of mistakes." "That's precisely what makes you qualified," he countered. "You have practical knowledge, not just theory, and you've proven what's possible with determination and creativity." Spring brought physical changes to the clearing as well. With hope secured in a carrier on her chest, Sarah planted a small garden in the sunny spot near the cabin's southern wall. The simple act of pressing seeds into soil felt symbolic, another kind of building, another investment in their future. Community continued to manifest in unexpected ways. A Saturday in April brought the rumble of trucks to her property. Miguel and several construction workers from his site, along with Jim and other volunteers. They arrived with materials and tools, proposing a work party to build a proper front porch before summer. "The baby will need outdoor space that's safe," Miguel explained, unrolling simple plans he'd sketched. "We thought you might accept a little help with this part." Sarah watched as they laid out lumber and discussed the design, offering suggestions based on their professional experience. 6 months earlier, she would have resisted such intervention, seeing it as a challenge to her independence. Now she recognized it as community in its purest form: shared skills, mutual respect, collective creation. By sunset, the porch's frame stood completed, the decking half installed. The workers promised to return the following weekend to finish, refusing Sarah's offers of payment. "Just some of your garden vegetables when they come in," Jim requested. "My wife says you've got the perfect spot for tomatoes there." That evening, sitting in her rocking chair with Hope asleep against her chest, Sarah surveyed her evolving home. The cabin remained modest by conventional standards, but had gradually accumulated the layered richness of a genuinely inhabited space. Its imperfections, the slightly uneven floors, the patched roof sections, the mismatched windows, no longer registered as flaws, but as character, evidence of resourcefulness and adaptability. On the newly framed porch, someone had mounted a simple wooden sign. Sarah hadn't noticed it during the day's activity, but now it caught the last golden light of sunset. Hand-carved letters spelled out Matthew's home, the wood sanded smooth and carefully sealed against the elements. She recognized Elijah's craftsmanship immediately, the precision of the lettering, the subtle decorative touches, reminiscent of older mountain cabins. More than any other gesture, this quiet acknowledgement from her most reticent neighbor confirmed what Sarah had been gradually accepting. She and Hope were home, not just in this structure she had built, but in this community they had joined. 1 year after Hope's dramatic arrival, Sarah stood at the edge of her clearing, watching the morning sun illuminate what her determination had created. The cabin looked different now, expanded by a modest addition, enhanced by proper siding, surrounded by carefully tended gardens, but the core remained exactly as she had built it during those desperate months of pregnancy. A testament to possibility, to refusing defeat when abandonment had left her with nothing but a patch of wilderness and her own resolve. Hope toddled unsteadily nearby, investigating a dandelion with the intense concentration only a 1-year-old can muster. Her dark curls caught the sunlight, so like Sarah's own but with subtle hints of Jack that no longer triggered pain when noticed. "She's growing like a weed," observed Elijah, who had appeared silently as was his custom. Now a regular visitor, he had gradually assumed the role of surrogate grandfather, teaching Sarah the rhythms of mountain seasons and Hope the names of birds that visited their clearing. "Running everywhere," Sarah agreed. "Can't take my eyes off her for a second." They stood in companionable silence, watching Hope's explorations. The relationship that had begun with reluctant neighborly assistance had evolved into something neither would have predicted: a quiet friendship based on shared values of independence, resilience, and respect for the natural world. The sound of approaching vehicles signaled the arrival of birthday celebration guests. Sarah had initially resisted Rita's suggestion of marking the milestone, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. But the event had naturally expanded beyond her control, becoming as much a community celebration as a personal one. Miguel's truck arrived first, his family emerging with wrapped packages and covered dishes. The librarian Marge followed, then several church members, including the once skeptical Mrs. Patterson. Jim and Rita brought a homemade cake, decorated with a tiny log cabin. Even Nancy, the retired midwife who had helped deliver hope during the blizzard, made the drive from the next county. Tables had been set up on the expanded porch, now covered with a proper roof and screened to prevent the bugs that accompanied mountain summers. Children played in the yard while adults arranged food and caught up on community news. Hope was passed from arm to arm, receiving kisses and small gifts with equal enthusiasm, her inherent sociability a stark contrast to Sarah's natural reserve. As Sarah moved among her guests, she reflected on how thoroughly her life had transformed in the past year. The community college workshops she taught had become unexpectedly popular, expanding to include classes on sustainable living practices beyond construction. Her garden produced enough for her needs, with surplus to share at the town's small farmers market. The non-profit case study of her building methods had been published in several sustainability journals, bringing occasional visitors interested in similar projects. Most significantly, her concept of independence had evolved. The fierce self-reliance that had driven her to build this home now coexisted with an appreciation for interdependence. Independence, she had learned, wasn't about doing everything alone, but about having the agency to choose one's connections and contribution. The birthday celebration transitioned into a small ceremony as Jim called for everyone's attention. He and several other community members had been working secretly on a project, he explained, waiting until today to reveal it. Miguel and two other construction workers unveiled a hand-carved wooden sign designed to mount at the entrance to her property. Matthews Wood's Sustainable Homestead, it read, with smaller text offering workshops and demonstrations by appointment. "We thought it was time you made it official," Rita explained, smiling at Sarah's surprise. "You've already been helping so many people informally. This just puts a name to what you're already doing." The sign represented more than just a formalization of Sarah's informal teaching. It acknowledged that her private refuge had organically evolved into something that served a broader purpose, a demonstration of possibilities, an inspiration to others facing their own seemingly insurmountable challenges. Later, after the guests had departed, and Hope was asleep in her crib, no longer the hastily constructed pine box, but still in the same spot, near Sarah's bed, Sarah sat on her porch reviewing the sketches she'd been developing. The small addition completed in fall had provided essential space as Hope grew, but Sarah now envisioned more substantial expansions, a dedicated workshop where she could teach smaller groups, improved rainwater collection systems, solar panel upgrades. These weren't just improvements to her living conditions, but investments in a future she was actively creating, rather than merely surviving. The skills she had developed out of necessity had become valuable expertise. The home she had built for shelter had become a platform for sharing knowledge. Her thoughts were interrupted by a tentative knock. Standing at the edge of her porch steps was a young woman, visibly pregnant, clutching a small duffel bag and the newspaper clipping about Sarah's story that had circulated widely after Hope's birth. "I'm sorry to intrude," the woman began hesitantly. "I saw your sign from the road. I've been carrying this article for months." She paused, gathering courage. "I'm in a situation similar to what yours was. I don't expect charity, but I was hoping maybe you could show me where to start." Sarah recognized the mixture of desperation and determination in the woman's eyes, the same combination that had driven her own journey. Without hesitation, she stood and extended her hand. "Come in," she said warmly. "We've got plenty to share." Inside the cabin, now softened by Hope's presence and a year of genuine living, Sarah put on water for tea. As she gathered cups and listened to the beginning of her visitor's story, she glanced at the small wooden plaque Elijah had carved for Hope's first birthday. A simple house shape, with words burned into its surface, "From scraps to strength." The phrase captured everything this place represented, not just her personal journey from abandonment to achievement, but the broader truth she now shared with others. What the world discards still holds value. What seems impossible becomes manageable with persistence and support. And sometimes building a home means not just raising walls, but opening a door